Hello, folks. My name is Mike Lavelle, and I'm going to be bringing you the presentation on the Battle of Britain. It's the overview of one of three programs we'll be doing. I'll be talking about those other programs as I go through this one, just referring you to them. But what I'm going to be focusing on today is the command and control that took place during the Battle of Britain, called the Dowding factor. I had the opportunity to live in England for 3 years. And during that time, if I mentioned to any of the native English people that were there, who were over 30 years old or so, and I said battle, they knew I wasn't talking about Trafalgar or Hastings or Waterloo. They knew I was referring to the Battle of Britain. And that's going to be our focus today. And what I'd like to take a look at is, how did all that start? How did the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 become just that, a battle, and how was it fought, and who were the participants? So we're going to start with a very significant day in English history, and that would be May 10th, 1940. That day, Winston Churchill was named Prime Minister of England, replacing Chamberlain. He was in the Conservative Party, and the reason they selected him to replace Chamberlain, who lost a vote of confidence, he was going to, they thought, be a better choice in order to negotiate a better peace settlement with the Germans, because things were not looking well at that point in time for the British, as we well know. Well, Winston had another idea. His idea is that wasn't the right time to do that. He thought they could stay in the war and stay in the war long enough to maybe turn things around. And he based that assumption on three things that he was looking at. One, the German economy, he felt, could not sustain any more expense to move forward and continue the war. They were at their end of the line. He also thought, because as he was developing relationships with Roosevelt, that the United States would be soon entering the war. Well, he was right about that, but it'd be 18 months later, and it had nothing to do with relationships. It had to do with the events that took place in December of 1941. And to help the U.S. Get into the war with Germany, Hitler declared war on the U.S. He also had an Operation Executive Order, which was basically taking folks from clandestine type of operations behind enemy lines to set Europe ablaze. Well, they would eventually do some of that, but at that point in time, they weren't anywhere near that kind of an operation. However, he was the right person at the right time, and he had a way of which to not only motivate and change things, but get the whole nation behind him. One of the speeches that he gave in the House on June 18th, and this was after Dunkirk, or Dunkirk was in progress, he said that Bomber Command will win the war. Well, actually, Bomber Command helped to win the war. His second statement, though, was probably more accurate. Fighter Command will be our salvation. And with that, we know later on he made another speech to Parliament that included these words you see on this poster that became available in October of 1940, pretty much after the Battle of Britain had pretty much been decided. Never was so much owed by so many to so few. So what I'd like to look at in the next hour or so that we have together is who provided the leadership, both for the Royal Air Force as well as for the Luftwaffe. And what challenges did both organizations face as they went against each other over the skies of Britain in 1940? And the combatants, did they have a strategy? And what was that strategy? How did it differ between the RAF and the Luftwaffe? And we've heard in history books, I'm sure most of you have referred or seen or read something about it. The British were up against tremendous odds, and they were. But really, who had the advantage? So we'll look at that. And if we look at the German perspective, is it different than what the British had? And the Germans that I've had the opportunity to speak with about this event, whether it be on the ground or in the air. And not that I spoke to a lot of them, but to a person, from their perspective, they did not lose the Battle of Britain. They just simply had to go elsewhere to fight because they've been assigned to go to the east instead of pursue the west when Hitler made the decision to switch emphasis and attack the Soviet Union. So the outcome, of course, is important. Some of it was very obvious and some not so obvious, and we'll take a look at that. But there's one other question we need to look at as well, and that is, why were the few successful? So to address that question, I'd like to introduce you to the person, basically why the Battle of Britain was successful for the British. And that would be this young gentleman that you see sitting in the middle of a table, having a tea party, a meeting, so to speak. And that young lad, his name is Hugh Dowding, and he would grow up to be Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, and he would be the head of Fighter Command in the summer of 1940. Now, the reason I use this photograph is that picture that you're looking at obviously reflects his childhood. And one of the things he said in some of his biographies, a couple of them actually, he said even as a young child, he did not accept an idea because it was the orthodox practice. And that's what really made him different. And he kind of stuck to that philosophy all through his youth, adult life, and of course into the Battle of Britain. And maybe that was one of the reasons, or primary reason, why he was successful in the position he had. I'd like to also mention that the two other children sitting in that table, the young lady on his left is his sister, who was a great aide during the Battle of Britain. She kept his house. He was a widower. He had a son who was flying in the Battle of Britain for Group 11. And after long days at the headquarters building and being concerned about all kinds of issues, that was probably the only person he really had to speak with. The young lad was his brother there on his right. He was in the Royal Navy and retired from the Royal Navy as an admiral. So obviously a military family. Now, Dowding wasn't what you'd call a spectacular student by his own admission. He had a lot of interest. He was an okay student. He was interested in the military, and he went to Sandhurst, and after graduation became a military officer, a career military officer in the artillery. He had some overseas assignments, which was very typical of British officers of that day throughout the empire, such as India, Hong Kong, and he had other interests as well. Apparently fairly athletic. He played polo and was captain of the alpine skiing team, which was a British organization, and you say alpine skiing team, but they were generally based out of Switzerland. Now, at age 32, he saw an opportunity in aviation, and that's kind of unusual. It was about 1912, 1913 when that drew his interest. So he was pretty much of a visionary as well. He never told his father about well, he did tell his father that he was thinking about flying lessons, and his father said, had a lot of influence on him, apparently, said, you're not to do that. Now, here he is telling a military officer at age 32 he's not to take flying lessons, but he went ahead and did that anyway. And he had to actually talk the folks into who were giving the flying lessons to advance him a loan, and he would pay them later. So it was fly now, pay later type of plan. He went to an organization just south of London, Brooklands, and there's a Farman aircraft that he was taking a few lessons on. And the reason he wanted to do this is that the Army was establishing the Royal Flying Corps. And if you had your pilot's license, they would accept you into the Royal Flying Corps and give you some additional training, and you would be making you a military officer. So with that in mind, he completed his training. Here you can see his pilot's license booklet, the British Empire. And if you open it up, you find that you've got the date at which he graduated, which is December 20th of 1913, and certificate number 711. That was maybe a number that would be any pilot would like to have, a lucky number. With that, he now is a member of the Royal Flying Corps. And as luck would have it, he was spot on with the opportunities that flying was going to present him, because World War I starts and he finds himself over in France as a squadron commander. And here's where he got his experience in terms of military operations and the possibility of aircraft being integrated into those operations. The things that he learned in World War I primarily was the realization of the importance of attrition. There he found out that you promote defense versus offense. The fighters were used initially to protect the observation planes as they gathered intelligence from the ground. After the war, he elected to stay into the military. And he had a couple of very important posts after the war, and that was he was the head of research and development. He was the director of that for the Air Ministry in the UK. And this was kind of the oversight of what the future would be, what projects from technology can be integrated into the Royal Air Force and have usefulness in the possibility of the next war. In that role, he oversaw the development of the new fighter aircraft that would become the Hurricane and the Spitfire, as well as what is referred to as radar. Actually, it was called radio detection finding. The term radar came in use in 1943. In that position, though, he made a few enemies in the sense that he was very harsh with other members of the Air Ministry as he was fighting for the new technologies of the Air Force. And he freely spoke his mind. And when he did that, he had the facts. When he had the facts, he didn't leave his opposition any way to save face, consequently having a few enemies in terms of perhaps petty jealousy, but nonetheless enemies that he had and would be continuing to fight with for the good of the Royal Air Force. Now in 1936, things were changing rapidly in Europe and other places. And because of the types of technology that were being incorporated through intelligence reports, such as new fighters the Germans were developing at the time, and what they were doing in terms of taking over and being very aggressive, the Royal Air Force decided to break into 4 major organizations. Dowding was hopeful that he would earn the position of head of all of the Air Force divisions or organizations. Well, because he did have some difficult relationships with the Air Ministry, one of the organizations that he had was broken up or called the Fighter Command. The other 3 would be Bomber Command, which was the premier part of the Air Force, the other being Training Command, and finally Coastal Command. Fighter Command was really the kind of the destitute child, and that was the one he was assigned to. And he was assigned to that, as it says there, in 1936. So from 1936 on to the Battle of Britain, that was his role. And he didn't complain about it. He took it on, and he took it on with vigor. He took it on with strategic planning, and he was very visionary in his thought what needed to be done and how it would be done. If you look at those eyes that Dowding has, those are the eyes that says, if you tell me to do something, I'm going to do it. I've only seen eyes like that in one other person. That was my 2nd grade teacher, Sister Gertrude Teresa. And ironically, that was my best academic year ever. However, moving on, when he took over that position, the first thing he did was look at what had been done before. In World War I, they had to have defense of the UK due to the bombing of the big aircraft that the Germans had, their large bombers, as well as their Zeppelins. He took that plan, and of course he was going to try to modernize it. So first of all, the responsibilities of Fighter Command, the first thing he decided would be these three: protect London. London, of course, is where your government is stationed and where decisions are made and where operations come from and orders. In addition to that, you had your industrial areas, which was called the Midlands, East Anglia, and the Southeast, basically the lower half of England, the south half of England. And then what you would have spread throughout the country would be fighter groups that would base your fighter element to defend England. So that was the basic plan. And that was a plan that was put in place actually in World War I. He had to modernize that and expand on it. In doing so, what he wanted to do is determine how many squadrons do you need and where are they located, and then what type of aircraft do you have to have for those squadrons. And he started out with that each group that you saw before, which was 4 of them, each group would be subdivided into geographic areas of responsibility. In that sector of that group, you would have 1 or more airfields. And when it's in those airfields, you are going to have 1 or more RAF fighter squadrons that were dedicated to the defense of England. And within each squadron, you'd have 12 to 18 aircraft. What that equated to would be 50 squadrons or 600 aircraft on the line. And that was a strategic plan that had been presented to the Air Ministry. And of course, since it was paper only, yea, verily, that looked reasonable to them. Dowding based that on that number of aircraft would inflict at least a 13% attrition rate on the enemy, which no enemy could withstand for any long period of time. So it was based on some statistical numbers and the studies that he had done. Well, he and his staff. But here's what he had to work with when he took over in 1936. Dowding had 18 squadrons of 288 aircraft. And most of them, as you can see here, such as the British Bulldog, the Hawker Demon, the Fury II, the Gloucester Gauntlet, these were aircraft that evolved from World War I, and they weren't meeting the standard of the day. Here he proposed, of course, when he was on the research and development director for the Air Ministry, new fighters, and he was insisting on the low-wing metal aircraft fighters with at least 8-gun armament. Because again, defense was his thing. And what he said, the best defense, of course, is have the number of fighters that would sustain major damage on the invaders, that they would not want to come back and participate in that. If you have just a force that is relatively strong, you can fight at least to a standstill. But if you have a weak fighter group or fighter command, what's going to happen is you're virtually going to be destroyed. So with that type of thinking, it's purely defense. And of course, he was hoping for a very strong defense, which to withstand an onslaught if there should be one. His concern at that time, obviously, was the Luftwaffe and its growth and development since 1933 up until 1940. And the other thing that he realized, that aircraft like they were developing were going to get to England a lot faster than the Zeppelins or the bombers of World War I. You had to have some kind of early warning device. And the British had been working on that since World War I. When he took office as the commander of the Royal Fighter Command, the Royal Air Force Fighter Command, this was the early warning system that was being researched and looked at. These are called listening posts, and what they are concrete structures with a concave build to them, and you would pick up sounds that were either in the air and unfortunately on the ground. If you look closely at one of these devices, you'll see that there's a pole. That was like a tuning fork. And inside the bunker below it, there would be equipment in which to try to decipher what that sound was. They worked, actually, and they put a lot of money into that. The problem is they couldn't tell distance very well. They couldn't tell if it was a ship or an aircraft or a milk truck in the village. So obviously, when he again was part of the Air Ministry Research and Development Program, he was pushing new technology for a better, more concrete way in which to detect aircraft approaching your shores. So if we switch over to that era, this is before he became commander of the fighter command, there was a committee called the Tizard Committee who was looking at all kinds of new technology. And ironically, Churchill had a scientific advisor who was purporting that they should be looking seriously at a beam which would destroy an airplane. And he turned that over to Watson Watt. And Watson Watt, who was the head of the National Physical Laboratory, a scientific community, had a very young guy there by the name of Wilkins. Wilkins realized that that wasn't ever going to work, that kind of thing. But he had noticed in his own research and development that when aircraft flew nearby an ordinary radio, the signal was disturbed. And he went with that to the point where he was going to tie that into an oscilloscope. And in February of 1935, they conducted an experiment. And this was backed, by the way, by Dowding. It was backed by Watson Watt, and he pulled together other scientists as well as the RAF. And this experiment, they flew an aircraft about 40 miles south of their location. And that aircraft flew a pattern. The aircraft, as you see coming into the picture here, was a Huntley Page Hayford. And the truck had antennas outside of it and a listening device inside with an oscilloscope. And it was really this young fellow by the name of Watkins who was the theoretical scientist and did a lot of practical work that would develop this system to make it work, that would turn into the radio direction finding stations that you see here. They turned out to be a tower. The taller tower is 350 feet high, and it would send out a signal that would contact aircraft in the air up to, on a good day, and depending on altitude, up to about 80 to 100 miles away at high altitude. And that signal would be reflected back to the receivers that you see here. By 1939, they had 5 of these that were really showing good operational performance and could do the job of detecting aircraft from an altitude of about 1,000 feet high up to around 22,000 feet high. Chamberlain came back in 1938 with a declaration and an agreement that there would be peace in our time. And he received, of course, a lot of criticism after the war. But the fact of the matter is that period of time allowed the British to catch up with not only their radio detection finding stations, but also their aircraft as well. So there was a breather in there which they could continue the development if war should come, and all those that were involved knew war was going to come. It was just a matter of when. So with that in mind, then that system and the way it worked was kind of the first line of defense before the fighters got involved, but would be integrated into the overall strategy of the defense of England. And the way it worked, basically, below those towers would be operation rooms that would be sending out the signal Any returns would be deciphered and then would be forwarded to a location where it would be interpreted so fighter command could respond to it. So if we look at basically how this system worked, in those blockhouses, you had your operators, and these were primarily women that were trained for the job, and that would take some time as well. But this operator is in one of the blockhouses where the signal is coming in, going down, and she is interpreting a oscilloscope that has been developed for that purpose. And what she is looking at on that oscilloscope is a series of patterns, which she can tell the range, bearing, and altitude of an approximate number, and they would get better at this as they use it, number of aircraft headed in the direction of the UK. Now, if we look at what she is doing, she is looking at that. She has a microphone, and this is her sitting back in the corner of a broader picture of other women auxiliary Air Force personnel that are part of that team in that same blockhouse. She is transmitting that information to the lady that is sitting in the center of the women that are over a map. What she is saying is the coordinates of where those aircraft may be, and they're plotting those coordinates. The woman in back of her is probably the supervisor or commander of that group. She is communicating that information then to RAF Fighter Command headquarters. And this was just one of about 52 stations that were online by the end of the Battle of Britain. But it was really kind of an ingenious system, because imagine that kind of reporting, it's all being directed to Fighter Command, which was called Bentley Priory. Bentley Priory was located in northwest London. And what it really was in 1936 was an abandoned estate. It was built in 1788. And after it served its purpose as an English estate, it turned into a hotel. After it was a hotel for a while, it was a girls' school, and finally shut down and abandoned and turned over to the RAF for their Fighter Command headquarters. So that's what Dowding received. That was his location, his headquarters, when he took over Fighter Command. He showed up at Bentley Priory, not in uniform, but he knocked on the door one day, and they wanted to know who he was. There was a skeleton crew there. The sergeant took him around. He said, "I want that office. I'll be back in the morning." The office he selected, you can see the arrow there, highlighted now in red. It looked to the south, because he thought if the Luftwaffe was coming, of course, they would be coming from the south. He could maybe have a view of that. So they had to convert that building in 1936 when he arrived into the headquarters that would be receiving all this information from those RDF stations that were going to be around the coast. So if we look at the floor plan, this is the way it was structured. Here is the front area, which is right here. And Dowding had another officer join him. His name was Keith Parks. And Keith Parks was a World War I veteran, 22 victories in World War I, from New Zealand, a brilliant tactician. He and Dowding got along quite well. Park understood what a fighter pilot needed to have in order to operate and be efficient, and what kind of information needed to be relayed to them. And so he was actually the senior staff officer well suited for that job prior to the actual Battle of Britain that he would take part in himself as group commander of Group 11 in 1940. So again, we're in 1936. Key to the information and receiving that information from the coastal sites of the radar stations would be telephone as well as teletype printers. All that information, because there'd be a lot of it coming from a lot of different directions, would be directed to a filter room. And that filter room would then plot where the most likely path of the incoming invaders would be to the operations room. Now, of course, this is all inside that building you're looking at. Ironically, in 1937, unknown to the RAF Fighter Command, the Air Ministry invited some German officers from the Luftwaffe to come and take a tour. So they were taking a tour through this building, and of course asking some very prying questions, but the RAF responded to, well, we are doing this and we're doing that, but we're purely experimenting, nothing's working yet, type of thing. So they didn't gain much intelligence from that. Obviously, for the war, you can't have your operations being exposed in a building that is not built or protected in any way. So in 1938, they started to go underground in the backyard. That's Bentley Pryor. You can see the red arrow pointing to the roof of Bentley Pryor that you just saw. And here you can see the bunker that was starting to be built in 1938 and completed at the end of 1939. It was about 42 feet underground. And underground, you would have your teams of plotters and flight directors above them operating. What you don't see the filter rooms, which are in the back of this wall. Those filter rooms would be feeding information to the ladies out here, would be plotting the incoming raiders. And of course, that information would be coming from your coastal radar sites that would be all along the south and the east coast of England. As that information is deciphered through the filter room and the plots are being read, the folks above them that you see here, they look like a little bit older gentlemen, and most of them they were RAF officers, primarily from World War I, who were fighter pilots, no longer flying, but had a good sense of intercept angles and things of this nature. And some of them became quite legendary in sending out squadrons of flights to intercept the invaders, and a lot of them were spot on. What they were doing, of course, they were kind of looking at the board that the women were moving the plots on and deciding what groups needed to be alerted and activated in order to make the intercept. So basically, that's how it all came together. And Dowding was putting this system together, as I say, just about from day one until the time the Battle of Britain started. Now, where that information was going out to the groups. There were 4 groups that were online during the Battle of Britain. That would be Group 10, 11, 12, as you see on the map there on your left. And most of the action was going to be taking place in Group 12 and Group 11. The reason for that is they thought originally, at the beginning of the planning of all this, that the Germans would most likely come from the east, but when they overran France and occupied France, now it would be coming from the south as well. So that information that was being filtered at headquarters would be sent out to the groups that would be being effective. And I've just highlighted here Group 11 as well as 12. And Group 11 had 7 sectors, Group 12 had 5 sectors. And each of the groups and sectors replicated the information, much like you see in this visual right in the middle here. By the way, this is the headquarters of Unkbridge, which was Group 11, and that's just outside of, a little bit outside of London. This was the headquarters of Keith Parks. So with that information then, you saw that it was being primarily manned and recorded by women. That was a big controversy. Dowding and Watson Watt fought very hard for the position of recruiting women into those positions. And the reason for such reluctance of having women in the positions of the radar stations, be it on the coast or be it on the airfields, is the feeling among the gentlemen that we're putting women on the front line, and they would have kind of a tough time if things got rough and bombs were dropping and what have you. Obviously, Dowding and Watson got their point across, and there was never a case of that, by the way. There were cases of some of the ground troops when the airfields were being strafed. They weren't seen for a while, but the women stayed. This picture is kind of an example of that. If you notice in the background, that roof is pretty well torn apart. That was right after a raid on Biggin Hill. The three women that are standing there are sergeants, Sergeant Mortimer, Turner, and Henderson, and they were pretty heroic during that attack. And this attack was in August of 1940. Mortimer went out while the battle was going, or the attack was going on, and was placing flags on bombs that had not exploded yet, or they were duds, and they had to be dismantled. Due to their efforts, they received an air medal, and it's kind of interesting. Of course, they were well received by the RAF pilots, etc., as you see here. And if you look at this, I just would like to point out there's another lady in this group that's kind of important to us who like history. This lady right here, her name is Felicity Peake, and she became the director of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And then when it became the Women's Air Force, she was also the director at that time. After the war, she did a lot of work and was very instrumental in helping to establish the Imperial War Museum, and was on that board for a number of years. She passed away in 2004. But in the meantime, there were a lot of women that were serving in the Royal Auxiliary Air Force or Women's Air Force during that Battle of Britain. Here you can see examples of other pieces that fitted into the overall Dowding system that was necessary in order to defend Britain. Because once you fly past the radar system, you go back to the old method of using your eyeballs and communicating. There was no longer any early warning. The enemy was beyond the early warning shield, so to speak. First of all, if you see those balloons in the background, each of those balloons would require about 20 people or so to crew. And the purpose of those balloons, I guess they had a couple of them. They were rather large. They were from World War I, and they're now called barrage balloons. You could get those up to 5,000 feet high. And the reason you wanted to get them high, they would prevent your dive bombers from coming any lower than that, therefore being less accurate. Of course, that depended on wind and everything else. Their size, they're about 65 feet long and 25 feet in diameter, so they were quite big. Other pieces of the Dowding system that had to be put in place was to train the observer corps. They were used primarily in World War I to spot aircraft coming into various sectors and groups. But now there's going to have to be more of them and spread out, because they were going to be your second line of defense once the enemy flew past the radar chain. The observer corps had to be trained. They number was about 32,000 of them. Most of them were all volunteers. And of course, anti-aircraft artillery is important in various locations around your industrial area, around the city of London itself. Dowding had to fight for the proper aircraft and aircraft guns. That was kind of a dotted relationship with the Army. The general who was in charge of artillery, his name was Pyle, And he sat right next to Dowding in terms of where his office was located, because now Keith Park had moved out of his office and was in Group 11, and Pyle moved into the office that was occupied by Park. So there's a lot of coordination effort that had to go on. So if we look at this overall system that was put in place, we have basically the radar stations. And I might add, you know, it's obvious. Why weren't those radar stations bombed during the Battle of Britain? Well, they were, but they were tough targets, and they were hard to hit simply because they were wide open. They were made of steel and wood. Shrapnel would fly right through them. But nonetheless, you had the radar stations sending out a signal, picking up, as they would like to refer, the raiders coming in. That information then, as we saw, would be transmitted to headquarters at Bentley Priory. From there, going through the filter room to the various groups, whether it be 10, 11, 12, 13. And then the group would then filter it down to the various sectors that might be affected by the raid coming into that area. So with that in mind, then, you had a couple of aircraft that may have been out on patrol. There were standing patrols that were along the channel. There were standing patrols that might be what they anticipated to be hot spots. Excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of water here. So they would be in the area. The sectors would know where their aircraft are because the aircraft had a device in them identifying them as friend or foe. Or you may need to have to scramble a group. And once the squadrons or the groups that were being scrambled to a target where the raider might be coming in, at that point, the squadron commander would take over and give the directions from that point. Up until that point, it was being directed by radar control. This is a whole new system, a way of fighting, a whole new way of integrating your different components into a whole that was all focused at hitting the right target. So with that, once, as I said before, you go past that radar chain or shield, your observer corps then takes over and has to feed information into the observer corps center, as you see here, who is telling that the aircraft appeared to be heading in this direction in our sector. And we also talked about the components of the anti-aircraft guns, where they would be placed, as well as the barrage balloons. So this whole system was divided up into basically a strategic part, and that strategic part would come from headquarters. They'd be in charge of where the new pilots would be assigned to the various airfields and the various groups, where the airplanes would be going, where fuel would be going, that sort of thing. Tactical was left to the group and to the sectors, so it would be below that line. And what's so amazing about this, and we know what Dowding walked into, and what he had to do, he had all that in place in a 5-year time frame. To me, that's rather remarkable, and I quite don't know how they pulled it off. But Dowding was including everybody, including scientists, including academia, including the RAF. He and Park, as an example, during the trial and test period of the RDF, would bring the scientists into the headquarters to work, not into from their labs, and work with the RAF. So all this was in place by the time the Battle of Britain began in the summer of 1940. Now, to kind of look at this and turn it into what the battlefield would look like for the opponents, this is kind of an overview. We mentioned the RDF stations that we just talked about, and they were called collectively chain home. Chain home were the ones that sent out the furthest signal from an altitude where they could read incoming aircraft from an altitude of 1,000 feet up to 2,000 feet or so. However, they did have a flaw. They couldn't do a very good job below that altitude, and so chain home low was basically a naval type of radar that they were using that could identify aircraft basically from 50 feet above the water up to an altitude maybe of 1,000 feet or so to cover that gap. So if we look at the way it would look, the green heavy line would be your chain home. They had further reach up to altitudes of 25, maybe a little higher, 25,000 feet or higher, and then chain low from 50 feet up to that gap. Throughout England, of course, they had all these stations. This one that you see here is one that is left. The English do a very good job with their history, and where they can preserve things for posterity, they do. So this one is a place called Southland-on-Sea, which is not, it's kind of out by the coast to the south of London. Great names in England, by the way. I went through a town that said, you're entering a spit in the road. And about 3 seconds later, a sign said, you're leaving spit in the road. And that was the size of the town. But anyway, they seem to name them appropriately. If we look at the opposing forces now, of course, you had the RAF, and you're going to have the concentration of Luftwaffe Air Fleets 2 and 3, which were the primary ones. Air Fleet 5 got involved a little bit. What's so unique about this fight? It's the only time in history where two air forces were going head to head and would not involve the Army or the Navy or any other components, where the outcome was going to have to be determined by air battle strictly. And if we look at the battlefield and you say, who had the advantage here? Well, if you look at these factors that you usually look at in any type of battlefield, we could say the British probably had the advantage in terms of terrain, only in that the pilots were flying over their home country. They knew the territory. They knew where the alternate airfields were. They knew how they could find protection, where the high ground was, etc. Weather would be on the British side because the German bombers would have to come in, and if cloud cover was involved in any way, shape, or form, that would interfere with the accuracy of their bombing. We have to look at the distance too. The British could take off and be at altitude, ready to meet the invader, and still be over their homeland. The distance involved for both the bombers as well as the fighters had limited reach. The bombers could probably get up to Liverpool, but the fighters could not. During the Battle of Britain, your fighters could remain over their protection area, that is South England, maybe for 15 minutes max. Response time, that would be favoring the British. If a radar site picked up a large fleet coming off of the fields in France around the Pas-de-Calais or so, and identify it and report to headquarters that reported to the group to get a sector aircraft to respond to that raid and get to altitude of about 20,000 feet or so, you're talking in the neighborhood of 20 minutes or so. Now, battle stress, anybody who's been in battle knows about battle stress, and it's just stressful. That's all there is to say about it. But I would think it'd be more stressful for the British rather than the Luftwaffe in terms of you could measure such a thing. The only reason I say that is the British had to stay at their airfields and wait to be called, either the bell to ring, a phone call, and it was just sitting by, standing by. The Luftwaffe knew the mission for the day, and they could plan accordingly. In terms of rescue, of course, again, the RAF is over its home ground. If they had a bailout, it would come over its home ground. In terms of rescue at sea, that would have to go probably to the Germans. They had a pretty good system using their Heinkel flying boat, the Heinkel 59. So that was kind of the situation in terms of advantages, disadvantages that helped, I would say, the British more than it helped the Luftwaffe. Now, the commanders for each of those groups, they remained commanders for the duration of the Battle of Britain. We had Keith Park move from headquarters to Group 11, which now was going to take the front of the Luftwaffe missions. To the north and across the middle of England would be Lee Mallory's Group 12. He too would be involved quite a bit, not as much as Park, but he was there to back up Park. Well, at least that was the plan. And then you had Group 10, which was off to the west of Park, and that was Quentin Brand. He did a great job backing up Park when requested. And to the north, you had Air Marshal Saul. He was protecting the north, got involved in a couple of conflicts in terms of the Germans coming in from the east. But his primary mission was to train new pilots in operations before they moved south. But the bulk of the activity was going to be in Group 11 and Group 12. Lee Mallory is an interesting case. He was a good officer in the sense of being brave, I suppose, had World War I experience, but very ambitious and would not buy into the way things were being done with fighter command. He did not like Dowding and he did not like Park, and made life pretty well difficult, especially for Park when Park was calling for backup and he was late to arrive because he was trying to implement his favorite tactic. He was an advocate of the big wing, which is a whole different story. But nonetheless, he was instrumental in helping to remove Park and Dowding from their positions at the end of the Battle of Britain. Again, another story. Now, speaking of battles, Dowding was fighting a number of battles. First, the battle to build and get the equipment he needed to defend the British Empire, not the Empire, excuse me, but the UK. And then he was now in a battle to maintain his fighter force that he was building up, getting Hurricanes and Spitfire squadrons online. And just about that time, Churchill is having a battle himself. He is trying desperately to keep France in the war, Italy out of the war, and the French are asking him for more and more fighters. That is, asking Churchill. Churchill, in turn, is asking the Air Ministry, who is sending orders down for Dowding to send over fighters to France to support that effort. Dowding had to take action. He thought he had an agreement to keep the fighters at home for the home defense. Again, for reasons that we just mentioned, Dowding was having to follow orders himself and giving fighters to the expeditionary force over in France. However, he did write a letter. As you see here, this letter is, it looks to me to be the 10th of May, or maybe that's the 16th, but at that time period, Churchill is taking so many squadrons of his Hurricanes and fighters over to France that Dowding just had to do something. And he wrote a very poignant letter. It was very positive, but he spelled it out with facts, which was very characteristic of him. And basically he is saying, if you take any more of the fighters from fighter command, we won't have anything to defend England with. And he was right. And fortunately, Churchill eventually realized that. And the result was, between May the 10th and June the 4th, for the Battle of France, here are the losses. 300 pilots for the RAF were lost. 386 Hurricanes would not be available. And the new fighter, 67 Spitfires would not be available. That's putting a huge dent in what was agreed upon, at least Dowding thought so, in order to defend the UK properly. And that would be to have a force that would at least give you a chance of a standoff. However, the Luftwaffe had some challenges too. Now, the Battle of France was over with pretty much by June the 21st. And now the Germans moved into France. And this is an interesting picture because it kind of expresses in a non-verbal way the dilemma that the Germans had, especially the Luftwaffe. This is a group of Luftwaffe staff looking out from the French coast over to England. And you can see vaguely out there the White Cliffs of Dover. And the Germans were under the impression, now that we're in France, certainly England is going to come to its senses. As a matter of fact, the foreign minister in 1938, German foreign minister, assured Hitler that we were not going to have to fight the English. They're not up to carrying the war on. Don't worry about the English. Now it's where we are. They're in France. As a matter of fact, they have territory from almost the Arctic down to the Bay of Biscay. And all they have to do is cross 26 miles at its narrowest point of the channel, and they'll be in England. So certainly, they're going to come to their senses and negotiate terms of surrender. I mean, again, about this time, it was that time that Churchill had another idea. So that fellow that you see with the question mark above his head is kind of perplexed. They're talking about it. Basically, they have no plan. That guy is Hermann Göring. And it's going to be left up to his Luftwaffe. If they're going to invade England, the Luftwaffe has to be neutralized and not be a factor. And he pretty much assures Hitler that would be the case. His Luftwaffe could do that. But in the meantime, Hitler realized by July that England was going to stay in the war, so he ordered Operation Silo, and that was basically a plan to attack England. How serious this plan was, well, that's always debatable to this day in history. Many historians feel that it wasn't a solid plan as much as it was a study. And maybe they're pretty much right, because the Luftwaffe was never involved in being integrated into this plan other than some cursory meetings. However, it was real in terms of their thinking about it and putting resources to it, such as barges and ships and what have you. But again, before they would be able to cross that channel, they're going to have to deal with the RAF Fighter Command. But here was the problem. Luftwaffe's strategy from pre-war days was actually aiding Britain, because the German military integrated with the Blitzkrieg the Air Force to go ahead and soften up the road ahead, so to speak. And now the Germans are a victim of their own success, because that worked very well all through the war up until they occupied France. So they had to do something quick, and they weren't set up for quick action. And pretty much at this time, by the time they got to France, they were pretty well running out. They extended their lines of quick logistics to give them support. So now they had to take the time to set up airfields in France and in Belgium. Meantime, Hitler stands down about 25 army divisions. A lot of the leadership goes on vacation. And German intelligence continues to paint a rosy picture that's very optimistic. And all during this time, the RAF, thanks to Dowding, has a plan which to defend England. So that's where we stand when the Battle of Britain would begin. The main components, of course, radar is a main component, but radar doesn't shoot any aircraft down. That has to be done by your other enemy fighters. And there are a number of aircraft, fighters and bombers, obviously, involved in this Battle of Britain. What you see on this slide are some of the aircraft or models of that aircraft that were involved in the actual fighting of the Battle of Britain, those escorting bombers. And we'll talk about the bombers in a moment. But what I'd like to point out about this, the comparison, if you look at just the numbers, they're all pretty close. And when I have talked to fighter pilots who were involved during this period of time and asking them what the advantage is of one aircraft versus the other, just about all of them have said the real advantage is who sees who first. Now, we're going to have two other programs in this series. One will be by my colleague, Barry Ladder. Barry is going to talk about the development of the Hurricane and the Spitfire and what brought it into action and how it was operated. Along with that, we're going to follow up with a presentation by David Lednicer. And David Lednicer is going to look at the performance of these aircraft and what aircraft had the advantages and what aircraft had some disadvantages, and make a comparison that way. So these aircraft will be addressed. Suffice to say now, everyone who saw somebody first had the advantage, and that would go generally to the British because, as one German fighter pilot said, it was as if they knew where we were. They had big binoculars on us, and they came from out of the sun and consequently had the advantage. So that did help to a degree. Now, we talked about Dowding's plan, and what he wanted in that plan was 50 fighters, squadrons, in order to defend England. And if you look at the opening of the Battle of Britain and look at the number of aircraft that made up the RAF organization at that time, along with their airfields, there were 56 airfields, and these are how they were distributed among the various groups. You look at this number here, 50. Well, it looks in pretty good shape. Well, then you have to go deeper into the numbers, as they say, kind of like things we're doing today. Again, most of that activity would be with Group 11 and 12, as you see over here. And if we look how they are set up at this point in time, they have the modern fighters of the Hurricane and the Spitfire. And if you look at the total number of squadrons making up the Hurricane and the Spitfire, because really the Defiant was not a legitimate fighter for daytime fighting in the Battle of Britain, you only have 28 squadrons versus the 50 that Dowding was talking about. So the shortage, a lot of it was due to the fact that a lot of those aircraft were bled off to support the French during the Battle of France. Now, in terms of the Battle of Britain, we'll talk about the few now, and I just want to kind of put it in perspective here. The few that are referred to, and especially in that poster that we saw earlier, most people think is the RAF fighter pilots. Churchill's talk, when he referred to the few, was actually referring to not only the fighter pilots, but also bomber command pilots as well as coastal command pilots. And oh, by the way, some of those did fight. They transitioned them from their bomber or coastal command to fighter command. However, the Battle of Britain, in terms of dates, because most battles do have a date, was set at July 10th through October 31st. Why July 10th? There was a big raid on Kent that took place July 10th. Why the 31st? Because by that time it was well established that the Luftwaffe has changed its tactics, and they were now going into a new operation where they're primarily, and for the most part, attacking at night. But let's look at the numbers. Those pilots that flew between July the 10th to July 31st, 1940, that total number you see below of 2,353 would receive the Battle of Britain class, as you see here. The number of pilots that lost their life in the Battle of Britain was 544. And if we look at the number of German pilots that were lost, either prisoners of war or killed in action, that number was 551. So right there, pilot for pilot, that is pretty much equal or leveled playing field. What's different, though, is the number of pilots that also lost their life. I guess let me go back to what I did here. Whoop, going the wrong way, sorry. Whoop, what am I doing here? Yeah, okay. The crew that you see down at the bottom here, crew members, 2,111. That was due to the bomber crews that became prisoners of war. Going up to the total number of pilots, again, that received the Battle of Britain clasp, 2,353. You might ask, how many survive today? The number that survive today is around 2 that are still alive that I know about. The 10 years ago, that number was more in the neighborhood of 35 to 40. So another interesting fact is if you look at the number of overseas pilots, 218 pilots from overseas, they kind of filled an important gap because they would have could, in a sense, not in a true sense, but in a sense, replace the pilots that were lost compared to the pilots that were lost for the Germans. And here's that breakdown of nationalities that's flew for the RAF from overseas. And the Czechs and the Poles were legendary in forming squadrons and made huge contributions in terms of the number of aircraft that they downed while they were flying for the RAF. In the United States, we had a number of pilots who flew for the British before we entered the war. That number varies depending on the source. I've seen as low as 6, I've seen as high as the 11 here. The reason it's so hard, many of them had changed their names. If you were a pilot from the US and you flew for the RAF before we entered the war, that would be a federal offense. And so if you did that, came home, and we weren't in the war, you could have gone to federal prison. Many of the pilots went to Canada before they went to England, and that's how they got over to England. And some of them did change their names. However, one notable one, Billy Fisk, who was an Olympian, and he flew with the RAF during the Battle of Britain. Now, I noticed also here, in fact, it's kind of interesting. They had one pilot from Jamaica. I just wonder who that lad was. The opposite side of the channel is where the enemy would reside, and you have their leadership is at the very top. Goring, who was the number 2 man right under Hitler. He had more power than any other officer in the the German military. Some of the commanders, however, were quite different and good commanders, one being Kesselring, Air Fleet 2, which is based in a part of northern France as well as in Belgium, and Spirl, who looked just kind of like a mean guy, but they were very capable leaders. And of course, one of their aces, Adolphe Galland, all of them were very capable. Their biggest problem probably was their top leadership from Goring on up. A lot of politics in the Luftwaffe as well as all of the German military. But nonetheless, their air fleets were well stocked with a number of fighters, bombers, and the way they operated, each group or fleet was sort of self-contained with bombers and fighters. It wasn't broken up and segmented like it was in the RAF. That had some advantages and disadvantages. Some of the disadvantages was their communication, and especially within the bomber fighter ranks of aircraft to aircraft. That would cause some problems. Now, if we look at the dates for the Battle of Britain, and we take July 10th through the 31st of August, 1940. It has been broken up into a number of phases by a number of historians. I've seen as low as 3, which I'm going to use here, as high as 6. It just depends on what you consider to be the Battle of Britain, but we're going to be focusing on the one of the summer of 1940. So from July 10th, 1940 to the 31st, the first phase, which we'll do a quick review of each of these, would be the Channel phase, where the British were trying to isolate Britain, put it under siege, if you will, and attack the ships as well as some of the airfields and ports along the British coast across from Belgium and France. That shifted to another phase in August, around August the 8th of 1940, where they shifted their tactics and their strategy to the airfields to wipe out the RAF. That was their plan. And then the last phase would be the attacks centered on London, starting out in the day and concluding at night, about through the August 31st. As you look at this, they've changed their tactics 3 times. In other words, they really didn't have a strategic plan. Their leadership was reactionary rather than thinking things through and planning for what's to come and how we're going to react. So we'll take a look at each one of these phases. And of course, there's no clear date. And this date one started, this date the other began. There was always some overlap between these phases. To look at the Channel phase, it starts out on July the 10th, and you see some heavy attacks on shipping. And they were using primarily their Stuka dive bombers. The other thing they wanted to do during this phase, that is the Luftwaffe, they wanted to draw out the RAF. They wanted to do battle with them. Again, they would like to start eliminating some of the opponent. Both Park as well as Dowding realized this, and they didn't send large groups into the battle. They sent groups in there to respond, certainly, to help protect the ships, but they weren't going to put all their assets on the line at any one time. So they were judicious with the resources that they were using. If we look at the actual intensity of that battle as the ships went through the Channel, and you could see them, the Germans could see them coming right from where they were based. They did a lot of damage to a lot of the ships, that caused a lot of tonnage to be lost. Dowding was saying, why are you going through the Channel? Why don't you go up through the Irish Sea to Liverpool, or at least go into Glasgow and to Edinburgh, to Scotland? But they continued to try to badger their way with resources through the Channel and up the Thames. And you look at all the intensity of the attacks and the results of loss of aircraft, the Luftwaffe lost 261 aircraft to that phase, and the British 127. Clearly, the Luftwaffe wasn't putting the dent into the RAF as they had hoped. And this caused them to rethink and come up with, let's attack the airfields that are closest to the Channel. And most of those airfields are in group most of them are in group 11, some in group 10. And we'll concentrate our effort there, and we'll wipe out the Luftwaffe. And this is where Göring said, give me 3 weeks and you will no longer have to worry about the RAF. So they switched to that phase. And in this phase, again, you can see it what's highlighted here. This was a very intense period of the Battle of Britain. And if the RAF couldn't withstand this, this is where they would have probably lost the battle itself. The reason they did not, it was for a couple of reasons, which we'll mention as we go through this. But all the airfields in this area were kind of bunched together. That's where most of your airfields were, as you saw on a previous chart. Now, if we look at this and say, why did the Luftwaffe stop this method if it was being successful? Well, we're going to talk about that, and we'll show you why. First of all, the bombers that were going to be used. The bombers being used for this effort was the Heinkel, which is the 111, the Ju-88, the Dornier 17. The Heinkel was a high-altitude bomber. The Ju-88 would be a medium and low level bomber. Also, it could act as a dive bomber. And the Dornier 17 would serve primarily as a low-level bomber. The way they were going to hit these airfields was on a daily basis, and sometimes they would do 2 or 3 attacks a day, sometimes on the same airfield, at least 2 attacks a day throughout this campaign. What I like to do is just kind of show you a typical one that was focused on Kenley, that was kind of the same as the same methods were used on others as well. And by this time, there were cat and mouse games being played by the Luftwaffe, sending squadrons different directions to the same target, splitting up as you came across the channel, trying to confuse whatever method they were using to detect these units flying into the UK. So on this attack, we're going to have air bombers coming in. These will be the high altitude bombers. That would be the Ju-88s and the Heinkels coming in from the east onto Kenley. We're going to have the low altitude bombers coming into Kenley from the south. The high altitude bombers would hit first, and maybe 5 minutes after their attack, you'll have the low altitude bombers come in to finish the job. That's a complex way of doing it, especially when you have to do it by dead reckoning navigation as well as timing. So looking at it in a broader perspective in terms of coordination, you have other airfields. Here is Kenley. You have a number of other airfields, Biggin Hill, Seven Oaks, and there's others around that area. These bombers are going to have to be coming in. These will hit first, provided they have no opposition to disturb their timing. And the low altitude bombers are coming in from the south, hitting the coastline around just above or to the east of Brighton, and then heading north. So if we look at this and see how they have to navigate through land objects, navigation points, it's difficult even under conditions of good VFR, as we'll see here in a minute. And there's Kenley, just to the south of London. So here are the low-level aircraft crossing the channel. You can see the cliffs of Dover. If you look at the shadow on the water, these aircraft can be no more than 100 to maybe 50 feet above the water, trying to avoid low-level radar. Once they hit the coast, Burgess Hills, which is that village you saw on the previous map, is right here. Now they're headed north towards Kenley. You see the shadow on the ground, again, very low level. They're looking for their initial point where they're going to form up. And that initial point for their low-level run here is going to be a place called the North Hills, or North Downs, rather. That is probably maybe 200 feet high. But that's the initial point for their run, and it's about 4 miles south of Kenley itself. Looking at Kenley, this is the airfield that from a satellite from today. You can still see the remnants of it. You can see the this is where the revetments would be, where the airplanes would be parked. Here were your hangars. Out here were your sector control room. But you can see clearly, as I said before, that's what it looks like today. A diagram of that airfield is what you're seeing now. Interestingly, as you look at this, you see some kind of a device here, which is called the parachute cable launchers. And that was a new device that was being implemented rather than the barrage balloons. And actually it worked on this raid, and I'm going to show you an example of that in just a few seconds here. But the raid is coming in from the south, off north of that initial point, 4 miles to the south. They're coming across the field, and when they arrive, there were no damages from the high altitude bombers. The high altitude bombers, due to the confusion of the war and other factors, bombed the wrong airfield. So the folks at Kinley knew they were coming. The scene you see here are results of the bombs that the low altitude bombers dropped. First of all, this damaged Hurricane was sitting in this revetment right here. That damaged Hurricane took a pretty good hit from shrapnel, but it was back in the air the next day. One nice thing about the Hurricane, as opposed to the all-metal Spitfire, damage like that can be repaired in a hurry. They destroyed 4 hangars. As you see here, there is 3 of the 4 hangars. They have 4 hangars, but they damaged the 3 of them. And as you look into that hangar, there are no aircraft sitting in that hangar. Consequently, Dowding and Park knew about what was going on and moved most of the aircraft to the north, or they were in the air during this intense period. So little damage to aircraft on the ground by the Luftwaffe was done during this airfield attack phase. As a matter of fact, I think the number stands at around 21 aircraft were destroyed on the ground during this phase. And the other thing is staff cars got hit, which was kind of an inconvenience for some officers, but other than that, that was minimal there. What they did not hit was the sector control room, and that's the nerve center that is sending your fighters to intercept the Luftwaffe bombers. They completely missed that. Of course, they dropped bombs all over the airfield, and once raids were over, you had not only the staff of the airfield, but citizens from nearby would come out and fill the holes and have that airfield, especially if it was an all grass airfield, back in operation within a few hours or so. So they did not take out many airfields at all. I think Matson was shut down for 3 days and maybe 1 or 2 others. But most of the airfields remain open during this whole period of airfield attacks. Now, I mentioned the parachute cable system that I pointed out on the schematic of Kinley Airfield. Here you can see the way it would work. An aircraft is coming across the field. Again, the Kinley folks on the ground knew they were coming. They timed it right because 2 of those Dorniers that were flying low-level missions, as they were, you would fire the cable off, and a weight would pull the cable and have a parachute at both ends. Now, the way that basically worked is you have this cable strung out, the aircraft flies through a cable. It's not to take an airplane out of the air, it's basically to wrap around that aircraft. So you now have drag caused by those parachutes. And even if both of your engines were operating at normal capacity or full capacity, you still had 7 tons of drag, which is going to take you to the scene of the crash, which in this case, 2 of the Dorniers fell subject to. This is one of them, and if you look on the leading edge of this aircraft, you can see where the cable cut into the wing and brought the airplane down. And here's where the Germans lost a number of good pilots. They were losing some of their key personnel during the Battle of Britain. Even in the Channel phase, that first week of the Channel phase, the Germans lost 3 of their top aces. Many of them had experience, not only in World War I, they had experience in Spain as well as Poland and France. And they lost a lot of good folks, as you see here. The oldest pilot, by the way, was 54 years old. He was a Heinkel pilot in the Luftwaffe. He was taken prisoner as well. Now, another important component that's not often thought about is turning your airplanes around, because these guys were flying sometimes 2 or 3 missions a day. Your ground crews were on the front lines as these airfields were being attacked. When the airplanes would come back, whether they be their own squadron or others, their job was to get them back in the air. And they got very good at this. And they were operating in some pretty tough conditions. Here you can see evidence of that with the wellies on this gentleman here. Apparently this is an all-grass airfield. But they could do a good job of refueling, arming, oiling, getting the airplanes back in the air in about 30 minutes or so. There's always some humor that can be seen in some of these pictures if you look through the books. This one happens to be an officer having his haircut. This is the way you had to do it. If you're going to get your hair cut, it had to be in between missions. His Batman apparently is taking care of that for him. If we look at the results of the airfield attacks and the aircraft losses, it wasn't really doing what the Luftwaffe wanted to do, although this was a very, very critical time for the RAF. There are these heavy attacks on the airfields about through August the 13th through about the 19th or so. This was supposed to be their, the Luftwaffe's, what they referred to as their Eagle Day. They were going to finish off the RAF. The RAF kept getting reports from, or excuse me, the Luftwaffe kept getting reports from their air intelligence that the British have no more than 50 fighters left. We're almost there. And they would go out and come back and say, there's really not evidence of this at all. But here, as you see, they were losing a lot of folks during these heavy attacks. Then something happened in favor of the British that goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the battlefield. There was some bad weather that set in and very little flying was done. During that time, the British were able to bring in replacement pilots that were desperately needed and have a break from the intense activity. And if we look at the rest of the things that started to transpire during August and to the end of August, there was again little activity, and the Luftwaffe seemed to be indecisive as to what it wanted to do and how it wanted to go about making its attack on these airfields. Again, looking at the bottom, the numbers reflect the losses of aircraft. You have about 229 losses of aircraft for the Luftwaffe and 395 or so for the British, which leads to the question, what did the airfield attack do for the Germans? Well, it was intense, no doubt about that. Lots of attacks on the airfield. But the fact was the strategy did not have the anticipated results. Many of the raids that the Luftwaffe conducted were due to bad intelligence. They were bombing naval airfields. They were bombing training sites. They were bombing alternate fields. At that time, too, the RAF was really getting very good, and that is the folks in the RAF operating the radar stations at position and intent of the raids. And they were meeting them at good intercept angles where they had the advantage. The German attacks, again, basically was due to poor intelligence. Their intelligence officer, as you see here on your left, his name was Beppo Schmidt. His qualifications actually were pretty minimal for an intelligence officer. He spoke no foreign language. He did not travel prior to the war. He was not technically oriented, nor was he a pilot. But I guess he was a very good friend of Göring's. And he was the one that was giving intelligence reports that the folks at the operational level of Luftwaffe learned to take with a grain of salt, especially your commanders like Adolf Galland. Another thing that was really important too is replacement aircraft. And in 1940, Churchill placed in charge of aircraft production Lord Beaverbrook, or William Akins. He too had a son like Dowding that was flying in the RAF in Group 11. Both of their sons survived the war. Both Beaverbrook and Dowding became pretty close, good friends. He would always call Dowding every night and say, "What do you want?" And he would say, "More fighters," and he would say, "They're coming." Beaverbrook was a bit of a renegade. He did not go to headquarters. He operated from his home. He referred to the air marshals as those bloody air marshals. He would know how to hold people accountable. Winston Churchill put him in charge, as I said before, in 1941, in charge of aircraft production. If we look at this chart that you see here, and his appointment was in February of 1940. Here was the plan for the number of total aircraft, around 1,400. The reality was there were 779. When he took over, he started to take names and make people accountable, so that as time progressed and into the Battle of Britain, you can see about the time of the Battle of Britain, the planned production line has met the recovery line, and now his efforts are exceeding the planned line, which is in blue. If we move to the months of the Battle of Britain, where they're most intense, you can see the total production numbers up here, 1,600, about 200 aircraft above what was planned. And if we look at just the fighter portion of that, we have 496 aircraft in the month of July, fighter aircraft, as well as 776 for August. Part of that was the shadow factories that were moving this aircraft, smaller components out initially to where they could be built up into bigger components and bigger shadow factories for final assembly. Because naturally your aircraft assembly plants and other wartime assembly plants would be targets of the Luftwaffe. The end result was the plan was exceeded under Beaverbrook's leadership. Whether it was all to his leadership or things were in place, it doesn't much matter. He kept it going in the right direction. So now you go to your operational losses for those months of August and July. It's broken down by your Hurricanes as well as your Spitfires. If we look at the total number of aircraft losses in July and as well as August during the height of the Battle of Britain, you're going to see the total losses, but we take the number of fighters produced in those months, they exceeded the losses. So clearly, you had plenty of airplanes. Airplanes were not the issue. What was the issue? The crisis was really that heavy time in August 10th to the 18th that we just talked about, where you lost 154 pilots, and now you only had 63 replacement. So that was a real key. For everybody's shock and surprise, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. And basically the way that came about, during a raid on London, the targets were supposed to be purely military or the London ports. Apparently, a bomb was hit into the city of London itself, whereupon Churchill decided to have retribution, and he bombed Berlin with a 1,000-plane raid. They scraped together all the bombers they possibly could. That, in turn, got Hitler very upset and decided all gloves are off. We're going to take it to the British and we're going to start bombing their cities. And that started the initial bombing of the cities of London, as well as others such as Manchester, Liverpool, etc. but they were going to start off with London as a start, and that began basically September the 7th through October the 5th, and that was a daytime operation. This was a blessing in disguise, because as Keith Park said, when he realized that that was happening, he didn't know why it was happening and couldn't believe that the Luftwaffe was doing that. It's just when they had the British on the ropes, and they were pretty desperate at that time. I guess Hitler becomes a very good ally in a sense by making those kind of key decisions. The whole idea was to hit the railheads, of course, overseas supplies, civilian morale they would go after, and just break the back of the RAF. Well, they have not done that. As a matter of fact, during one of these raids on September the 15th, the Luftwaffe was really, really hit hard. The aircraft from the north, from Group 12, helped to do a lot of damage on a big raid on London. Now the Luftwaffe said, well, we can't keep doing this. So shortly after that, what they would do, they would switch to their night tactics. Ironically, this is kind of a campaign diary. It's a campaign diary that was done day by day for the Battle of Britain. I'm not going to read it all, but this is the day the British decided it was going to be the anniversary day of the Battle of Britain, which they started to celebrate in 1942. And of course, this year we're doing the 80th anniversary, and this series is part of our remembrance in regard to that historic battle. Loss of aircraft were exaggerated on both sides. You can see huge numbers here, like the enemy aircraft destroyed 176 fighters. The reality was they did lose a lot, and so did the British, but the numbers weren't as great as being reported. Nonetheless, that caused the Luftwaffe to change tactics from day to night, and that pretty much started to curtail the activity of the Battle of Britain during the day. The defense that the British had for that type of operation was pretty limited. They had the searchlights along the coast, of course, and to the south, the barrage balloons, and they were working on night fighters. Dowding, after he would spend all day at headquarters, would often go off and see how the progress was being made on the equipping the night fighters with proper detection equipment in order to intercept night raiders. However, before that was completely finished, he was removed from the fighter command spot after October the 31st. This is the overall British attitude, and I kind of like this picture. You see in fact, I like it a lot. The nonverbals express pretty much what it's about. You see a bombed out house or storefront, a British flag, people standing there rather defiant, and this sign says, "Business as usual, Old Bill still at your service," as you see right here. Dr. Price, a well-known historian in the UK, has done a great analysis of the Battle of Britain. And what I find interesting about this, you can read this at your leisure, but what I'm going to do is hit the summary point, because if we go back to what Dowding was planning in his initial study as a 13% loss rate, what it comes down to, the result was 17 British aircraft for every 10 fighters, and that would mean 5 pilots. So the actual attrition rate of all that data in there was pretty close to that 13% that he had predicted. And here are some not so obvious points about all that. The Germans probably, because they did not have a good strategy, had no chance whatsoever of putting a force on the UK. They had to get rid of the RAF. They did not. The Germans really lost the battle because they were using tactical aircraft as well as tactical maneuvers where strategic aircraft were needed, and they just did not have those strategic aircraft. Another thing would be the poor intelligence, as we mentioned before through this briefing. And the other thing that is maybe obvious is the RAF, did they win the Battle of Britain? Well, they didn't necessarily win, but they certainly avoided defeat. And that was a key. They thought they were going to have to renew this battle in the spring of 1941. But Hitler had other plans, again, making a key decision that helped the Allies. Let's go and attack the Soviet Union. The result, I'm sure, would have been really different without Dowding in command. He was, like Churchill, he was the right person at the right time for this sort of thing. And it really changed American opinion, where Roosevelt, shortly after the Battle of Britain, in fact, March of 41, was able to enact the Lend-Lease Act, which would lend material support very openly, as well as training RAF pilots here in the States. And that would, of course, be the start of our relationship as an ally in World War II. Here's the thing that Dowding put together. I'm not going to read them all, but he started out with a shortage of aircraft, modern aircraft. He was instrumental in making sure those aircraft were on the drawing board before he took over for fighter command. Airfields, he had to get more airfields, winding up with some 50-some or 56 or so. He had to take care of all the training, selecting the personnel, the integration of the RDF system with the fighter command as well as the observer corps. It was really remarkable what it put together. And so if you kind of look at this, it really was their finest hour, largely to Dowding and his efforts of bringing everyone involved. Now, when he was dismissed from office, and he was done so in kind of I guess a very unprofessional way, they didn't utilize his talents or his skills. They could have put him in charge of developing the night fighters. They did not. However, he was asked to go to the U.S. as a consultant to the aircraft factories, and he did that, and he did a good job, and he was very instrumental in helping give good input to aircraft like the P-51. When he came back, he was asked to write a synopsis of the Battle of Britain. He did. They didn't print it. The Air Ministry put out their own book, as you see here, October of 1940. Now, they didn't put it out at that time. That's when that was the date of it. In that history, put out by the Air Ministry, they never mentioned the word of Hugh Dowding at all. However, he did write a very moving letter to Fighter Command when he left in October. This is dated 24th October, 1940, although it was known by the end of October. He just made it in a few words, heartfelt thanks. And like he said, never before has so much been owed by so many to so few. A debt remains and will increase. And that's why we are where we are today, I think, because we're appreciating what those folks did. The fighter pilots themselves would celebrate from 1942 on. I like this picture because there's a lot of them gathered around Dowding, who is now out of the service. The lady that you see standing next to him, that's Henderson, who you saw earlier in a photograph, receiving the Air Medal from Biggin Hill. And he was well recognized by his fighter command, fighter boys, as he called them. This shot was taken 10 years ago for the 70th anniversary. All those gentlemen have since deceased, but I was able to find their service pictures, which I superimposed on top of them. And what I find remarkable when I look at this is that although we all age, and hopefully we get to the age you saw those gentlemen, but if you look at their eyes are the same. And I think every one of them would say, "I do it again. Just bring the airplane out, get me in it. I'll show you how." The folks that I talked to who flew in the Battle of Britain, to a person, were quiet, unassuming, and basically had the attitude of this statement here, that they didn't want to be remembered as heroes. They just wanted to be remembered for what they'd done. And every one of them that I've talked to said, it wasn't just us, it was all of us. And they met the people on the ground, their crews, as well as the people of England, who were volunteering in a number of ways to come out and support them. So it's a good thing that the English like their history and they recognize it where they can. It's amazing where you find it. This is a Google map, and the English like to honor the people that participated in major events. This is just right outside of Biggin Hill, the Biggin Hill Airport, you can see here. And it's still active today. There are signs all around it from the Battle of Britain. But driving around it, where the barracks used to be, is now a housing development. And if you look into that housing development, the name of the streets, Turner, Henderson, and Mortimer. Here are the ladies that you saw earlier when they received the air medals. In 1976, they brought these ladies back. Two of them were alive at that time, to help celebrate an activity at the Biggin Hill Airport. Also, if you look at other names on those streets, Atkins, that was named after the son of Lord Beaverbrook, who was a pilot in the Battle of Britain. And here's a very interesting poster. This poster was printed in the thousands, and it was kept by the post offices of villages around the country. If the Germans invaded, it was to be put out and about in the area of the post office routes. It says, "Keep calm and carry on." That was a poster that was never put out. And it was basically thanks to this man, Hugh Dowding, who received some recognition because his fighter command insisted that he be recognized. There was a statue on the Strand in London that is there. And there's a statement on both sides of it. It says, "To him, the people of Britain and the free world owe largely a way of life and liberties that we enjoy today." And certainly that's true. Here are a few references that you can do further study on if you would like to at some point. There will be a way in which to submit questions if you have any, and we'll get those answers back to you. And I would encourage you to keep an eye out for, and you'll receive information about the other talks in this series. One is coming up by Barry Latter on the development of the Hurricane and the Spitfire, and that will be followed by Dave Lednicer, who will talk about the performance of these aircraft that were involved in the Battle of Britain. I thank you for sitting through this program. I look forward to talking to you sometime down the road in the future, hope this summer. And I'm going to be signing off from a location where I'm broadcasting from, which happens to be the Cattle Track Arts and Preservation Group. And I'm coming to you in a place that I'm residing now. It's not a hangar where I usually am, but it's called the chicken coop, literally. So, have a good day and take care. Hope to see you soon.